The halls of Drakkar Prime were forged to intimidate vaulted ribs of dark alloy, rivers of light running through the floor like captured lightning, banners that told history without admitting doubt. In such a place, the dragon princess Sarinath learned a subtler art than war: how to keep her chin high when entire empires refused to meet her eyes. Suitors came in procession and left in retreat, their speeches polished, their reasons as brittle as old glass. One had sworn he could tame the iron flame, and fled after one conversation, in which she had asked him, gently, what he loved, besides conquest. Another brought a fleet as a dowry, but flinched when he realized the princess's gaze could tell alloy from gold, sincerity from ceremony. The last arrived with a prophecy in his pocket, and tried to fit her into it. She did not. They called her unyielding, dangerous, a creature born for battle rather than vows. What they meant was that she would not make herself small for rooms that preferred smallness. Sarinath carried the rejections the way a blade carries oil thinly, invisibly, necessary to continue. In private, she kept a garden of heat behind her ribs, and vowed not to let it scorch those who came unarmed. Yet the court's murmur was relentless. Too bright, they said, too proud. As if brightness were a crime, and pride a disease. She stood at her father's side through audiences and verdicts, and watched men bargain for her as if kingdoms were rugs to haggle over. Night after night she washed the scent of politics from her hands, and wondered if anyone would ever touch them for reasons that weren't strategy. The emperor, for his part, was a mountain taught to speak. Drakkarath had carved an empire with patience and pressure, and it had obeyed him in the way stone obeys a river. But fatherhood required other tools. He saw his daughter standing inside a fortress of expectations, and did not know which wall to break without bringing the ceiling down. He offered prizes to the galaxy's highest houses, and the houses smiled with all their teeth, and declined. Somewhere between anger and grief he found only resolve. If the suitors could not see value, let them keep their blindness. No more parades, he decreed. No more auctions disguised as festivals. The court bowed. The rumors fattened. On the night that decision hardened, the sky above Drakkar Prime wrote a different sentence. A Terran repair craft, small as a splinter against the twin moons, came in on a trail of fire and bad luck. It clipped a mining lattice, shed a wing like a broken promise, and skipped across the high desert until it agreed to stop. The impact shook dust from temple eaves and startled the palace's old war kites into flight. Out in the salt flats, amid shards of heat glass and a line of new craters, a human mechanic unbuckled himself from survival and laughed the hoarse, disbelieving laugh of men who have outrun statistics. His name was Darren Holt. He had grease in the lines of his palms and a history in the set of his shoulders that said machines had been kinder to him than people. The drone he dragged from the wreckage beeped in broken complaint and then settled into a sulk, one rotor clicking like a metronome with a grudge. Darren patted it with the absent-minded affection of a man whose hands never forgot a friend. "We made it, Spanner," he told the sky, "which means someone's about to charge us for landing." He set about triage with the calm of habit, cutting the drive from the power spine, before it staged a meltdown, caging sparks with a collapsed panel, listening to the wind the way mechanics listen to cooling metal. When the palace skimmers arrived like silver beetles over the dunes, he raised both hands, then thought better of it, and raised the busted capacitor in one, and his ID chip in the other, as if the universe might finally take him seriously if it saw he owned something official: soldiers. In mirror-black armor ringed him with the professional melancholy of men whose work always arrives late and loud. "Terran," their captain announced, as if identifying a stray constellation. "You crash on Imperial ground." "Ground crashed into me," Darren said, and glanced toward the capital, where the sky lit itself from within. "Do you do toes? I pay in gratitude and old jokes." Protocol did not find this funny. The captain did not, either. But his second, the kind of woman who measures competence by callus, tilted her head as if to admit that anyone who made that kind of joke with a smoking ship at his back deserved at least to be fed. They secured him. They secured his tools. They lifted the drive core with reverent suspicion. And they carried everything that still had a pulse toward a city that did not need more stories and was about to get one. Saranath watched the skimmers cross the horizon from the highest balcony of the Royal Eyrie. The wind up there arrived unfiltered, tasted of iron and distance. She followed the glittering dots with a hunter's focus and a child's curiosity and felt, against her will, a tug behind the breastbone that did not register as dread. Something was inbound that did not care for crowns. She straightened, set her shoulders, and prepared to meet it without armor. It is difficult to be a legend and still be surprised. That night, the world prepared to surprise her. They brought him through side corridors polished by the boot soles of generations who had practiced dignity here. Darren registered as much of the palace as a man can, while counting the tremors in his own hands. Spanner, patched with a strip of heat tape and pride, floated at shoulder height, making a noise that could have been diagnostics or fretting. The doors to the audience hall opened like lungs. Light pooled on the floor. Sound sharpened. Protocol arranged itself in tiers. At the far end, on a dais that refused to apologize for being a dais, the Emperor sat with the quiet weight of an anvil on a workbench. Useful, immovable, waiting. Beside him, half a step down, but somehow higher by presence alone, stood Saranath. She wore no jewels, only a narrow torque at her throat that turned with her. Her wings were folded, a cathedral at rest. In the glass of the chamber, her reflection looked like a creature invented to remind architects to be humble. Terran, announced a chamberlain, whose voice had been trained into silk. You fall from our sky and into our patience. Name yourself. Darren Holt, he said. Because names are the first repairs we can make on any conversation. Mechanic. Everything else changes. Courtiers made that particular sound reserved for the collision of honesty with ceremony. Darren felt 30 eyes, find 36 reasons to dislike him. He also saw 3 engineers in the back try not to lean forward. He looked at the Emperor long enough to be polite. Then, looked at Saranath, because every room has a gravity well and pretending it doesn't is cowardice. He had expected menace, or the cold lacquer of nobility. What struck him instead was the calibration of her attention. She watched as if listening for a truth people try to hide behind noise. The old ache that lived under his breastbone. Something like loneliness. Something like gratitude. Delayed. Shifted. Words arrived without permission. You're magnificent, he said. Not reverent. Not performative. Just reporting as a man reports a voltage. Armor creaked. A priest inhaled a reprimand and choked on it. Saranath's crest lifted a fraction, a reflex older than etiquette. The Emperor's eyes narrowed to the width of a choice. Darren felt Spanner headbutt his shoulder like a friend begging him to reconsider breathing. Saranath stepped forward, not quite smiling. Do all Terrans speak as if they are falling, she asked, or are you improvising for me? Only when we land somewhere. That makes sense, he said, and only for people who deserve to hear it. The court had no script for this. Dracorath let the silence run to the point where lesser men break it, then set his voice down where it would do the least damage. Why are you on my ground? Because space is rude, Darren answered. And when the Emperor's jaw inclined a degree toward inquiry rather than execution, he continued. Because a mining lattice doesn't respect Terran thrusters. Because I trade repairs for fuel and stories. And didn't stop to ask whose air I was paying for. I can fix your lattice. I can fix my ship. I can fix this little drone if someone brings me a screw that isn't decorative. Insult, hissed a noble. Inventory, Darren corrected. I'm good at inventories. He hadn't looked away from Saranath. It felt dangerous and correct. He saw the poise everyone praised, and the fatigue no one mentioned. He saw a mind that had learned to bear weight, and still wanted to learn delight. He did not see a problem to solve. He saw a person. Later, much later, Saranath would tell him that this was the first moment in which love felt less like a risk and more like relief. She did not have that language yet. What she had was an impulse to test. The way a pilot tests a gust. "You do not fear me," she said. "I fear plenty," he answered. "Empty tanks, failing seals, people who want to buy the part of you that makes you yourself. You aren't on that list." "What if you are on mine?" she asked, and the court's breath caught on the edge of scandal before realizing she was teasing and not threatening. Darren's mouth tilted. "Then I'll bring offerings. Coffee, wrenches, bad jokes that work better than they deserve. Protocol." Battered by novelty, surrendered a small laugh to the room. The Emperor did not join it. But the set of his shoulders changed from verdict to study. He gestured, and the guards eased by a degree. You could feel in the air. They did not dismiss Darren. They redirected him to a triage wing where the palace physicians eyed Terran physiology like a crossword with missing clues. To a repair bay where his drive core waited on a cradle like a wounded animal that trusted nobody. To a small suite with a view of the inner gardens where water admitted it was tamed but refused to be bored. He slept in intervals, the way men sleep after impacts, with his boots close and a list forming behind his eyelids of all the things that would break if left unsupervised. On the second morning, he woke to the sound of someone sorting his tools by weight rather than size. He sat up too fast, saw Silver at the door, and stopped apologizing for existing. Saranath stood in the threshold holding Spanner upside down while the drone hummed, offended but fascinated. "It climbs walls," she said gravely. "This seems useful for avoiding meetings. It also gets stuck in vents," Darren replied, retrieving it. "Useful for avoiding dignity." She crossed the room with the careful economy of someone built for strength and practiced at gentleness. Up close, he noticed the things legend doesn't bother to record. Hairline nicks along 2 crest plates. A faint scorch on the inside of her left wing, where a spar had once failed her. The way her eyes brightened a half-shade when she was about to enjoy herself. "I came to see the Terran who declared gravity a conspiracy," she said. "Also, to ask why your ship insulted our mining lattice." "Because I taught it to swear in 3 dialects," he answered. "And then because the conversation felt like a bridge that could hold more. And because I am better at fixing than asking permission." "We are alike," she said, and the admission landed between them like a tool laid down with care. They walked to the hangar without escorts. The war kites hanging from the ceiling twitched as they passed, as if recognizing authority and choosing admiration instead. Darren put a hand to his drive core's casing, felt the ripple of heat where it should not be, and frowned in a way that made Saranath look at the thing as if it had personally disappointed her. He talked as he worked, not to fill silence but to include her in the rhythm. How the current should hum when you've convinced a system to forgive you. How bolts tell the truth before meters do. How machines are braver than people, because they try until they break and then keep trying. "Is that bravery?" she asked, watching the blue-white flare of his torch reflect in his eyes. "Or obedience?" "Depends who's holding the wrench," he said, "and whether the hand believes in what it's doing." "Do you?" she pressed. He looked up, met the question without armor. "I believe in repair. I believe in making things whole without pretending they were never broken. I believe in you," he said, surprising himself with how simple it sounded in the air. "And I don't know you yet, but I believe what I've seen." The torch hissed into quiet. Somewhere high in the rafters, a pump changed key, as if giving them privacy. Saranath closed her eyes for the space of one breath, then opened them with a new calibration of light. "Very well, Darren Holt," she said. "If you are to fix the part of our sky you bent, you will allow me to help. Teach me your way of listening." He handed her the insulated clamp he trusted most. "First lesson," he said. "Everything speaks. Even courts. Even engines. Even people who've been told to be louder than their hearts. You touch here, here, and here, and you wait. Waiting is part of the work. She placed her claw where he indicated. The current purred. The heat settled. Spanner, jealous of not being the center of attention, attempted to wedge itself between lesson and teacher, and received a fond tap that would become the first of 1,000. In the far palace, Rumor tried to decide whether to grow teeth or wings. In the hangar, the princess of dragons and a human with soot on his jaw leaned over a stubborn machine and, without announcing it, began the craft of saving one another. The hangar breathed cold at dawn, a long exhale rolling off the hulls like fog. Darren arrived, with sleep still creased in his face, and a mug that lied about being coffee. Saranath was already there, a silver silhouette among sleeping engines, her palms resting on the skin of his battered drive core as if feeling for a pulse. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Machines tell their truth to anyone patient enough to listen without trying to be clever. Here, he said, stepping beside her. Touch these 3 points: ground, feed, casing. Don't force. Count heartbeats, not seconds. She obeyed, and the metal hummed under her, touch thin, wary. Alive. It's afraid of spiking, she murmured, surprised to hear her own voice treating hardware like an animal. It's been punished for trying too hard. Then we give it permission to try again, he said, easing a regulator open by a hair. Not a turn. The current steadied. The lie in his mug smelled friendlier. They worked until the lamps learned the day. Darren's hands moved with that unshowy certainty of people who have spent more time fixing than explaining. Saranath's grace compressed itself into precision. The arc of a torch, held just so, the patience to let solder cool before asking it to be brave. Spanner orbited them, exchanging unsolicited opinions, and, on 3 separate occasions, drifted directly between their faces, with the scandalized chirp of a chaperone who had read too many romances. By mid-morning, the palace steward descended with a retinue of disapproval and a scroll full of polite warnings about propriety. He found a princess with a wrench in her fist and a Terran teaching her how to listen for a lying bearing. The warnings died of natural causes. The lower lattice is still offline, the steward announced instead. Miners from the outer flats await authorization to return. There is unrest. Saranath looked to Darren. Not because she needed permission, but because partnership had begun to feel like a habit. He wiped his hands on a rag that had been many colors in its youth and nodded. Let's fix the part of the sky I bent. They went on foot as far as the city's edge, and then by air, her wings catching thermals with effortless intelligence. His harness clipped to a sling along her spine. The first lift always stole his breath. The rooflines dropping away, the desert turning to hammered copper, the wind writing temporary scriptures across her membranes. He felt the strength in her, the restraint. She felt the trust in him, the way he offered his weight without tensing for betrayal. The lattice rose from the flats like a harp built by a god who liked geometry, 30 towers, 30 taut cables. The cities, wind harvest playing across them to feed the grids. 2 struts had collided during his graceless descent. Now they sulked as if punished. They landed on a catwalk 300 meters up, and the structure sang a wrong note through their bones. Don't shout at it, Darren said over the wind. Offer it a better song. He hooked a temporary brace with one hand, and, with the other, teased a kinked cable, until the tension stopped lying. Saranath leaned out into open air, wings closed, balance absolute, and welded 3 inches of alloy as if stitching skin. Below, miners watched from the salt rim, craning necks. Work paused, children waved. Spanner, bored by gravity, crawled into a maintenance duct to see how far echoes travel, and returned covered in honest dust. They argued amiably about methods, his Terran habit of improvising with what the day gives. Her imperial precision guided by long memory. When the wind abruptly shifted, he slipped, The harness caught. Her hand caught the harness. For a half-second their eyes met above too much sky. No one shouted. She lifted him back onto the catwalk with the same care she used on a warped panel. He laughed breathlessly. Gravity has opinions. So do I, she said, steadying him with a thumb on his shoulder. And you will go home with all your bones. 2 hours, 4 burns, and a handful of names they would later apologize to the lattice for calling it the wrong note. Resolved. The harp of towers settled into a chord the city recognized. Lights rippled awake across the outer districts. Work resumed with the relieved cheer that follows a held breath let go. They didn't return to the palace. Not yet. Darren insisted on stopping at the low quarter, where the condensers had been dragged from starship wreckage a generation ago and never properly respected. The first unit greeted them with a cough and an honest wheeze. Saranath knelt on sand and soot, shoulders broader than the doorway, and let a fest child hand her a screwdriver with the solemnity of a coronation. Darren rerouted a pipe with a length of copper he'd scavenged, explained flow as if telling a bedtime story, and when the pump finally chose to purr, the cheer that went up had nothing to do with royalty and everything to do with water. "Princess," a woman said. Disbelief and gratitude tangled in her throat. "We didn't expect." "Expectation is a poor architect," Saranath answered, rising and dusting her knees. "Tell me which other units lie." They stayed, until dusk taught the roofs to glow. Darren walked beside her down an alley that smelled of oil and cumin and metal cooling correctly. People bowed when they recognized her. She returned the respect, without stealing their time. When a boy asked if the Terran was her servant, she almost laughed and then, thinking better of it, said, "He is my teacher. Today we trade lessons." They reached the ramparts as night poured over the city. Below, the fording ramparts, lattice glittered like a constellation that had come to visit. Above, the twin moons argued calmly about brightness. Darren leaned on the stone, arm warm where her wing brushed it, and let the quiet arrive first. "You could have commanded," he said. "You chose to carry." "I have carried a long time," she said softly. Today felt different. How? As if the weight were voluntary. She looked at him sidelong, and shared. He looked back at the city, at the small lights that meant supper, and the larger ones that meant someone somewhere had not finished their work. "Sharing is the only trick I know," he said. "Everything else is practice." They stood in that honest silence until Spanner, offended by romance, announced that the drone's navigation had detected a bakery, and it would be treason not to investigate. Saranath laughed, bright and brief, and for a moment, the entire wall wanted to keep the sound. News travels faster than cables. By morning, the court had already chosen its posture half scandal, half curiosity, a quarter hope it refused to name. Dracorath convened the Council of Engines in the Celestial Vault, a hall whose ceiling held a map of every mechanism that kept the Empire breathing. When Darren and Saranath entered side by side, no fanfare, only the smell of solder and tea, the map glittered with an area pulsing amber. "The Crown Array," announced the Master Engineer, voice tight. "It regulates our shield harmonics and atmospheric flow." Overnight, the 9th tone slipped. "We have redundancy, but not patience. If it falls out of chord, we will know wind the way deserts know it." An elder noble, with scales polished to a mirror, turned, letting his words find a target. "Majesty, this is no time to indulge Terran experiments." "It is time," Dracorath said without raising his voice, "to stop worshipping mistakes that wear uniforms." His gaze moved to Darren. "You asked to repair the fold, harm you caused. Will you accept a task you did not?" Darren looked up at the map until amber filled his pupils. "Show me the array," he said, and the last 3 men who yelled at it. The Crown Array lay in the city's spine, A shaft of air and steel. A ring of projectors the size of wagons. Cables humming with more power than a fleet. The ninth tone rode a cable that had been routed 2 degrees wrong 20 years ago, and never forgiven. Engineers had added patches on top of patches, until patchwork became doctrine. The array had learned to live with a limp. Last night, it got tired of pretending. Sarinath stood on the rim of the shaft and inhaled. The sound pressed through her bones like surf. "It's shouting to be heard," she said. "Everything else is shouting back." Darren strapped on a harness and checked the clips twice. "Then we'll ask it to speak softer and teach the rest to listen." He looked to the master engineer. "I'll need release control on segments 4 through 12, bleed-off authorization, and," he smiled at Sarinath, "the only person here who can hear when I'm about to be stupid." "You will be stupid," Spanner predicted from his shoulder, approximately 9 times. They descended into a cathedral of machinery. The air tasted of copper and weather. Darren moved along the ring, like a man walking the edge of a drum, stopping to lay his palm on housings, counting beats, understanding which surfaces told the truth and which told the story they had been bullied into repeating. Sarinath moved opposite him. A counterweight and a chorus. Her fingertips on anchor points. Her breath matching the array's cycle, until its pulse shifted to include her. He found the kink where it lived in an elbow joint no one had loved in years, wrapped in prayer tape and excuses. "There you are," he whispered, and felt Sarinath's attention brighten across the shaft, as if a second sun had cleared a cloud. He loosened a tie, eased a grommet, rotated a brace by a degree that would never look like heroism on a schematic. "Bleed 4, he called. "Half on 12. 7. Hold your temper," valves hissed. The ninth tone wavered, then slid further off. A siren in the upper city considered its options. "Darren," Sarinath said calmly, the word traveling under the noise like a cable under a river. "Your hands are fast. Make your thoughts slower." He exhaled, let his spine find the rhythm he'd taught a dozen stubborn pumps and 1 exhausted heart. "You're right." He closed his eyes, listened past the shouts to the tremor beneath them, the original, shy signal, trying to remember its name. "It wants less tension and more support," he said. "We've been asking it to carry what the 8th should." "The 8th is proud," Sarinath replied. "It hates being told to share. Then we don't tell it. We show it." He glanced up. "Master engineer permission to steal 4 inches of cable from the ceremonial run to the vault chimes?" Her eyebrows rose. "That run is symbolic. Symbols don't need slack," he said. "Machines do." She hesitated the exact amount of time it takes for pride to concede to proof. Granted. They grafted the length with a splice, ugly as sin, and reliable as gravity. Sarinath braced the joint with a claw until the alloy remembered its courage. Darren tuned the braces, 1 half-turn at a time, speaking in numbers and apologies. The 9th tone trembled, sighed, and slid back into the chord like a tired singer finding harmony. Above them, the city felt the change first in its vents and then in its shoulders. Doors stopped arguing with their frames. Flags learned their proper angle. A flock of market kites that had been fighting a crosswind suddenly rose in a clean arc and decided not to tangle themselves in the fishmonger's poles after all. The amber on the vault map cooled to green. They climbed out to a ring of faces arranging themselves into new opinions. The master engineer wiped her hands on a rag and, without ceremony, offered it to Darren like a medal. "You stole from a bell to feed a throat," she said. "I will forgive the blasphemy." The mirror-scaled noble cleared his throat, searching for a way to be right retroactively. "This does not prove. It proves we have been admiring the paint on a door we were supposed to open," Dracorath said. He didn't look at the noble. He looked at his daughter. "What did you hear?" "That my city prefers gentleness to obedience." Saranath answered. We have been training it wrong. Drakarath's gaze shifted to Darren. The weight of a lifetime of rulership settled into something else, consideration. Perhaps. Or the ache of an old idea yielding. You move as if all this were your house, he said. I treat houses better than I treat myself, Darren replied, half smiling. You can verify, with any roof I've known. A ripple of laughter broke where it needed to. The tension loosened. The court found breath it hadn't earned, and took it anyway. After the meeting, they walked a quieter corridor lined with windows that tired of pretending to be walls. The city below had relearned its rhythm. Children on a rooftop jumped rope to a beat, the array now kept without complaint. Saranath touched the glass with the back of her fingers and saw her reflection share the view with the life she was sworn to protect. You stole cable from a sacred chime, she said, amused. I'll donate it back when we build redundancy in the place that actually matters, he said. Besides, bells like to be part of a story. They stopped at a landing where the wind could find them without making a scene of it. She turned to him, closer than caution, and let the last of her practiced distances dissolve. When you spoke to the array, she said, I understood something I have never allowed myself to know. It's called being held. For the first time, she admitted, voice low. I would like that. He did not reach for her because some invitations deserve the courtesy of time. He only nodded, warm and certain, as if agreeing with a machine that had finally chosen the right key. Behind them, Spanner coughed theatrically and muttered to the window, If either of you require a bell for symbolism, I know where to requisition 4 inches. The laugh they shared was quiet, private, alive. Far below, the city breathed with them, grateful not to be shouted at anymore. By late afternoon, the air felt wrong, like metal after a hard cut. The crown array held its new chord. The lattice sang true, but the horizon had developed a bruise, the kind of blue that makes birds quiet, and old engineers find their lucky rags. In the market quarter, a seller muttered that it smelled like comet fall, that rare phenomenon when dust in the high exosphere ionizes and pours down sparks like cold rain. In the palace vault, 3 instruments disagreed politely, and one stopped disagreeing at all. Which is how instruments announce fear. Darren had Spanner on the bench for a temperamental gyro transplant when the first ripples struck. The lights shivered and steadied. The floor did not. Saranath was through his door before the second tremor, crest lifted, eyes gone bright with the pilot's math. The skyloom, she said, without preamble. The skyloom spanned the eastern gorge, a braid of conduits and load-bearing bridges that ferried power, clean air, and water to the farming tiers. The upper vault's models showed what Saranath felt in her bones. The loom was catching the blue storm like a sail catches wind. It would overstrain in minutes. If the loom failed, the low terraces would lose motive water. The gears that climbed the canyon would chew themselves to teeth. Night would land where supper should be. They took the high runners instead of a car. Narrow maintenance trams that skimmed the skin of the city. No railings. No excuses. Darren drove with his jaw set to steady. Saranath, standing behind him with one hand on the ceiling rib, balanced the way mountains pretend to be. The wind sharpened. Sparks began to stitch themselves between towers, not lightning but cousins of it, blue threads that hummed and sought metal like gossip seeks ears. The loom revealed itself all at once. A cathedral of tension lines woven from alloy and audacity, anchored in granite older than empires. Its main cable, big as a tree trunk, arched across the gorge, its side strands splayed like harp strings fallen into engineering. Tonight it sang a frantic key. A gang of keeper engineers in orange mantles clustered at node 12, fingers flying, faces tight. Bleeders won't hold, shouted the master engineer over the whine. The ion wash is filling the lines, faster than we can vent. If the main flips polarity, we'll cook half the pumps downstream. Don't bleed, Darren called back, already clipping into a safety line. Borrow. He was moving before anyone told him not to down the catwalk, across the gusset, onto the exposed spine, where the loom's glory refused to be convenient. Sarinath shadowed him without a harness, because there are creatures built to negotiate with heights, and she was one. Spanner hovered at shoulder height and pretended not to be impressed. Darren dropped to a knee at the junction, where the main met a spreader bar, and pressed his palm to the anchor block, counting without numbers. "It's hoarding charge," he said, too proud to share. Sarinath leaned out into blue air and read the rhythm in her bones. The tertiary lines are idle. They were meant for festival lanterns and haven't carried load in years. And growled when it refused to budge. Sarinath put 2 claws on the collar and turned with the precise contempt of a woman who has opened too many jars for men who insisted they had it. The collar surrendered, embarrassed. Darren dragged a set of jumper cables from the crate at his knee and clipped them across the bus, then to the main. Then to an old ceremonial ring left over from parades. "We were bleeding power into heat," he said. "Now we'll throw it into light." The storm heard him and laughed in blue. Threads licked the cables. The jumper clamps thrummed like plucked strings. The loom shivered down its length, deciding whether to accept an insult that might save it. Darren glanced at Sarinath and saw that her pupils had narrowed dragon's eyes when they calculate fall, lift, thrust, and hubris. "If I open the bus," he said, "everything we send into the lantern loop will arc along the rim. It'll look like the city put on a crown. It'll also paint us with current. Then we do not stand where crowns want to be," she said, and hooked her arm through his harness to drag him 2 steps left. Sparks chased where his head had been, and found nothing to praise. He cracked the bus. The pry bar juddered. Metal talking to metal the way old kings talk to younger ones. The lantern circuit woke with a sound like nighttime breath, drawing down the loom's temper. Blue ran along the ring, then down auxiliary lines to ancient, ornamental nodes. Lamps that had not burned since the emperor's coronation flared, one by one, circling the canyon like a procession. The gorge lit up. The farming tiers below cheered, as if someone had decided to refill a festival that had never been official. Load numbers fell. Not enough. Sarinath had already moved 3 spans down, wings pressed tight to cheat drag, body one long line of physics. "The west counterweight is snagged," she called. "It's keeping the loom too taut. Can you kick it? Free. It will take me and our problem into the canyon." Her hand slid along a suspension wire, finding the micrograde grit that tells a pilot if her plan will hold. "I will go." "I'll go," Darren said, before his fear could negotiate. "You do not have wings," she answered, and smiled because terror enjoys manners. "Hold the song steady. I will change the verse." He wanted to argue until the storm ran out. Instead, he did the Terranly brave thing and let her. She went over the rail in a single, deliberate motion. A silver arc into blue. For a moment all the math in the world was decoration. Then her wings opened and all the math mattered. She rode the turbulent air between the loom and the cliff the way a good sentence rides breath, each feather angling, each tendon remembering choices. When she hit the counterweight housing, she hit it with precisely enough force to move metal without moving herself into myth. It budged. Not enough. She put her shoulder to it and growled a word that made the storm consider its life choices. Darren's hands worked their own problem. He pulled slack into the festival loop. He opened a second bus. He jumpered an ancient gong he'd been told was purely ceremonial, and felt it hum with the satisfaction of an obsolete system invited to dinner. The blue charge poured along the edges of the city and dropped into ground with a sound like rain heard from far away. Then the counterweight gave. The loom eased a breath it had been forgetting to take. Numbers dropped into range. The master engineer, who had not blinked in minutes, allowed herself a single syllable that could have meant any prayer. Sarinath scrambled back up the frame, talons scoring honest lines in steel. She was 3 spans from Darren when a fresh blue arc stitched between lines and bit the railing where her hand had been. The shock traveled and threw her off pattern. A pilot's nightmare. A wing. Half-stunned. The world becoming sideways. Darren moved again before his brain wrote a memo. He unclipped, stepped into nothing, caught the safety line with his elbow in a romance with gravity that would have gotten them both killed if the line had been less cooperative, and swung under the beam. He intercepted her like a man intercepting an idea too important to drop, the harness jerk turning both their ribs into percussion. For a heartbeat they hung held by a line, the city yelling its approval in the form of physics. She got her wing back. He got his breath back. Up close, amid the ridiculous fizz of blue, he said the sentence he had been holding behind his teeth since the day he had called gravity a conspiracy. I love you. Her face changed in a way no court would have understood. Not softer, truer. Then hold, she said. And the word carried 3 meanings now. Later. Always. They hauled themselves back to the spine with a coordination that made onlookers forget how to disapprove. Spanner rose between them, muttering about unsafe interpersonal dynamics near live conductors. And then, unable to help itself, recorded the scene twice for later bragging. Darren threw the last lock on the bus. Saranath braced the line while he did. The loom took its full breath and settled into a key the city could live with. When it was finally, beautifully over, Dracarath arrived not by procession but by stare, as if he had refused the lift because lifts are cowardly around real problems. He took in the blue-crowned gorge, the flaring lanterns, the way the auxiliary lines glowed like veins in a living hand. He took in his daughter with dust on her shoulders, and a Terran with burns on his knuckles, and a look on his face that emperors recognize when they are fathers first. I thought the city was on fire, he said. It turned out to be remembering a song. The loom was tired of being shouted at, Darren replied. We taught it a chorus. Dracarath's gaze shifted first to the song, Master Engineer, who nodded. Then to his daughter, who did not look away. Then to the human, who could not have, if he had tried. The Emperor exhaled. Not as a king, as a man who has not yet decided to be unkind. Come to the vault at dawn, he said, both of you. If the city is going to insist on behaving like a heart, we might as well decide what to do with the blood. Dawn found the celestial vault full but quiet. Courtiers had dressed like occasions, engineers had slept like sinners, and arrived forgiven by work. The city on the map above their heads was completely green for the first time anyone could remember. Outside, in the gorge, the last of the blue storm took itself apart with reluctant dignity. The lantern loop cooling to civility. Dracarath stood on the central dais without ornaments. When Saranath and Darren entered, the room concentrated in their direction the way a lens concentrates sunlight. The Emperor did not make them cross the length of the floor. He stepped down 2 stairs and closed the distance himself. I have ruled long enough to confuse obedience with health, he said, voice gentler than stone. You have taught my city to breathe without asking permission. That is treason against my lazier habits. I intend to pardon it. A ripple of laughter did useful work, punctured tension, fed courage. Dracarath let it subside. You, Terran. The night took us to a precipice. You moved as if falling were an instrument. I had a good anchor, Darren said. Meaning the harness. Meaning Saranath. Meaning the way a whole city had decided to share load instead of bleed it. The Emperor's mouth did the thing it rarely dared admit at amusement. Then it steadied. Claim a reward, he said. And the room tilted. Because old stories take this turn, and you do not always like how they end. Name the thing you want that is within my gift to give. Darren could have asked for ships, for citizenship, for an entire, quote, suburb's worth of roofs that didn't leak. He could have asked to be made safe. He thought of none of it. He thought of the voice that had said hold in blue, and how every machine he loved had worked better after someone believed in it. He went to one knee because balance requires it when you shift a load. And he said, with both hands empty, I want your daughter's hand. Not as a prize, as a partner. I will spend my life making the request true. Silence did the old dance. Outrage attempted to lead, and dignity cut in. Half the nobles inhaled to recite tradition. The master engineer looked at the emperor as if to say, I can fix many things. Not this. Saranath did not move away from Darren. She did not move at all. Her stillness was a verdict. Drakarath's face did not change for a long breath. When it did, it changed like weather a front passing, a new pressure system asserting itself. There is a right, he said at last, and the room found a place to file a hope, old as my grandfather's lies. It is not a duel. It is a proof. We call it the proof of future. He gestured, and the map overhead rotated, targeting not palace, not arsenal, but the low terraces he had too often let be managed by budgets rather than vows. You will take the heart from a decommissioned dreadnought, the Leviathan core in Bay 12, and you will convert it to a common hearth. It will power the lower city, and the canyon lifts without threatening their songs. You will do this without losing a finger, a friend, or the old names these machines gave themselves. If you succeed within 3 days, I will name you my son by law, and Sarinath's husband by blessing. If you fail, you will still be my first mechanic, because men who fall trying to build futures do not stop being useful. The court stared, because emperors rarely speak like water after rock. Darren stood, light-headed with the size of the moment, and nodded because anything else would be a joke that earned nobody's laughter. Sarinath's crest lifted a degree that meant both amusement and battle readiness. We'll need everyone who believes in bread, she said. They went to Bay 12 and found the Leviathan sleeping like a retired god. Its core was an old threat with a noble hum, coils bright with potential, logic stained by the kind of history that turns ports into scars. Darren put his hand on the housing. I know what you were taught, he murmured. I'm asking you to learn a different story. The keepers of flow arrived with coils of cable and thermos flasks, and the insubordinate joy of people finally pointed at a problem worth their hands. The master engineer rolled up her sleeves. Vorax Vol, armorless and chastened by the spectacle of competence, brought a crate of rivets and did not attempt to lead. Children from the low terraces appeared like weather to watch and to ask why, and Sarinath gave them jobs count to 100. Sing. When the frequency wavers, hand that wrench to the man with the burned knuckles. Tell me if that gauge looks like a moon or an eye. They began, not by tearing out the old, but by teaching it manners. Darren wrote a dialogue between coils and regulators, coaxed watchdog routines awake, and asked them questions no general had ever bothered to. Sarinath climbed into the gantry and loosened bolts that had married themselves to frames a century ago. Strength serving tenderness, not replacing it. They split the core's drive into 5 smaller lungs, each tuned to a different neighborhood's needs. They rerouted 3 ceremonial conduits from the palace chimes. Symbols don't need that much copper, Darren muttered, earning a scandalized snort from the chamberlain and a grin from the emperor himself, and used them to form a redundant ring that would fail gracefully. Not spectacularly. On the second night, with the city asleep and the gorge muttering to itself, the work faltered. An ugly harmonic began, crawling through the system like gossip through a barracks, souring everything it touched. Spanner's chassis vibrated in sympathy and swore in 3 dialects. Darren chased it down 2 subloops, into a control tree nobody had audited since kingdoms traded scrolls, and found the insult hiding in plain text, a wartime limiter that starved the poorest lines first under load. He looked at it too long and said nothing. Sarinath read his silence and stepped into it. We cut it out, she said, the sentence a vow. We do more, he answered. We replace it with preference in the other direction. If the city ever starves, the palace goes hungry first. There was a brief, bright argument in the council about tradition and security and the optics of generosity. Dracorath listened to it exactly long enough to remember who he used to be, and then signed the replacement order with a flourish that would later be etched into a plaque far from his statues. "Let the roof feed the floor," he said. "We have enough banners." On the third morning, before dawn could make promises it did not intend to keep, they stood in front of the common hearth, a machine that had been a weapon and was now a kitchen. Darren checked the last coupler. Saranath set her palm against the housing, closed her eyes, and breathed, and the core caught her rhythm. The master engineer threw the main with both hands and a defiant tilt of the chin. Lights swam on. Not a blaze, no conquering shout, just a soft, undeniable radiance that rose through the low terraces like bread steam. Pumps turned without whining. The canyon lifts groaned once in habit and then learned to purr. In the tenement where the old pump had lied, faucets laughed. In the school, a child put his ear to the wall and announced, delighted, that the building had decided to be kind. The palace dimmed by a polite degree. The vault map, above the court, drew a new icon at the canyon's edge and named it, without anyone instructing it to, Hearth. Dracorath came alone, which is an emperor's way of making a moment bigger by refusing to bring a parade. He walked around the common hearth, ran a claw along a seam that no one but an old craftsman would notice, and nodded like a man approving a weld. "You took a thing meant to frighten and taught it to feed," he said. "You have made treason against my lazier habits twice in as many days." His gaze went to Darren and then to Saranath and back again. "Not as ruler. As father. I keep my bargains." There was a form of words, antique and beautiful, that the chamberlain would have liked very much to hear. Dracorath did not speak them. He stepped close enough to put his palm on Darren's shoulder and his other hand on Saranath's, and he pressed them together the way a man tests a joint before trusting a bridge. "You have my blessing," he said. And the blessing sounded like a job assigned. "Build a life that feeds, more than it frightens." The court, hearing later how it had happened, would describe a fanfare, but there wasn't one. There was the sound of a city finding a new beat. There was Spanner whistling off-key and pretending it wasn't crying. There was Darren, who had no gift for speeches, turning toward Saranath with the exact expression he had worn under the blue-crowned terror. Relief, and the kind of joy that makes a man tidy his workbench so he can invite someone to live in the mess with him. Saranath took his hands, grease and all, and lifted them until their pulses met. "I accept," she said simply, "because some words deserve to stay uncluttered. Now come help me install chairs. The low terraces will be here by supper, and we have promised them bread." They tried to schedule it. Courtiers produced calendars like shields, plotted auspicious hours, argued over whether vows should be spoken under the emperor's banners or beneath the map of the city that now glowed with a new icon named Hearth. The argument ended the way good arguments do when a knock came at the palace gate, and the low terraces walked in carrying chairs. Not fine chairs, sturdy ones. Workshop benches on borrowed casters, school stools whose paint remembered chalk dust, a tabletop salvaged from a decommissioned hull door. Bakers arrived with loaves still clicking as they cooled. Welders arrived with sleeves singed, and smiles that didn't ask permission. The keepers of flow carried a spool of copper ribbon and announced, with cheerful treason, that all ceremonies run better with ground wire. Dracorath descended the dais and stood in the doorway like a man deciding whether to stop a river. He didn't. He stepped aside and let his city pour through. They set the place for work instead of spectacle. A broad circle cleared on the celestial forge's floor. Cables taped down with honesty. Kites from the river district hung like bright lungs in the rafters. The warship, Viraxion, revived and moored above, dimmed her running lights to a gentle pulse, agreeing to be part of the room rather than the point of it. Spanner zipped figure eights overhead, rehearsing a ring-bearer's route until 3 children bribed it with candied seeds to practice slower. Saranath entered without jewels, her scales clean and unadorned, a torque of brushed copper at her throat that Darren had shaped the night before out of spare bus bar and nerve. She moved through the crowd like a promise learned by heart. Darren waited in boots he had polished with oil because he didn't own anything else that shone. Palms nicked from the Leviathan refit. The Emperor's old torque ring riding his wrist like a lesson. A chamberlain opened his mouth to recite the old words. Dracarath raised a hand and traded poetry for use. "This is not a parade," he said. "This is a joining." The master engineer stepped forward, wearing a clean rag like a sash. She held up a length of copper ribbon that made the light blush. "We braid 2 circuits," she said, practical as a ledger and smiling as if she'd found one more bolt in the exact right size. "We do not ask them to become one wire. We teach them to share load." Serinath held one end. Darren took the other. Together they twisted the ribbon until it hummed faintly in their fingers. A tone you could feel more than hear. On a signal that was no one's but the room's, Dracarath set his palm over theirs, heavy as a benediction, and pressed the braid flat. The copper kept the imprint 3 hands, 1 mark. "Your vow," he said. Serinath's voice carried like breath through a house at dawn. "I will be shelter that does not own you, wind that does not scatter you, heat that does not burn what we have built. When the city shouts, I will listen. When you falter, I will lend you my spine. Bring me the broken things. We will teach them patience." Darren swallowed a laugh that wanted to be a sob and found words that had never been good at bows. "I will not fix you. I will keep my tools for what admits repair. Engines, habits, rooms that forgot how to hold a crowd. I will choose creation before victory and ask it to sit at our table. I will keep the kettle on and the door unlatched, and when fear tries to whisper louder than truth, I will answer with the sound of work done gently. Spanner, overcome, released the rings prematurely, and had to be bribed with a smear of honey to wait for the nod. Dracarath, whose mouth rarely remembered how to be soft, smiled without spectacle, and handed the bands over himself. 2 rings he had commissioned that morning from the shipyard. Not gold, but tempered alloy, thin as good judgment, etched on the inside with a single word, in 3 scripts flow. They were sliding the rings home when a tremor passed underfoot, the sort of sideways shiver that machines make when they are lied to. Heads turned as one toward the vault map. A sliver of amber flirted with the edge of the grid near the canyon lifts, then flashed red. The common hearth's output spiked 0.5% and held there, stubborn and wrong. The chamber gasped, expectation primed for drama. Serinath did not flinch. Darren didn't, either. They looked at each other, and the conversation that would have been an argument in another couple's mouth became a single nod. "We'll be right back," Darren said to the room, and took off at a jog. The sabotage wasn't theatrical. It was petty, the sort of mean trick a frightened faction plays when it has lost the larger argument. Someone had slid a limiter back into the line, coded to reroute surplus to palace fountains when the load climbed. It was clever in the way bad ideas are clever, arrayed with plausible deniability and timid about being seen. Serinath reached the panel, ripped away a cover with a curt, elegant violence, and stared down at a pair of cowardly capacitors. "This isn't a crisis," Darren said, breath steady. "It's a choice. We make it," she replied. They made it together, without ceremony. He cut the false bridge, she set her palm to the line, and lent the system a steady cadence until the governors relearned it. The hearth sighed back into range, and the lifts got their breath. In the palace, whose fountains had briefly flexed like preening birds, water retreated with a chastened burble. A saboteur who had counted on drama went suddenly, terrifyingly small. They returned to find the room unchanged by panic and transformed by pride. People stepped back for them the way a crew opens space for the specialists who can keep the night from swallowing a ship. Dracarath didn't ask for an explanation. He put his hand back over theirs and pressed the braid a second time, setting a new imprint in copper, the callus along Darren's thumb, the faint scorch on Serinath's wrist. Proof of work. Now, he said softly. As we were, Spanner behaved. The rings found their new homes. The sound that moved through the celestial forge wasn't the roar that crowns demand. It was a low, steady music made of relief and recognition. The exact volume a house makes when it decides to hold more people. After, there was bread and stories, oil for the hinges, sugar for the children, a toast with kettle steam because someone had forgotten the wine, and nobody missed it. Vorax stood awkwardly near the benches until a boy handed him a slice of brick oven loaf and said, "You look hungry," thereby ending a war in one sentence. The master engineer danced one slow, surprised circle with an accountant and admitted, blushing, that numbers have rhythm. Dracorath sat on a stool 2 sizes too small and listened without interrupting as 3 keepers argued about gasket materials in a corner, his smile turning into a policy he would sign in the morning. Saranath and Darren slipped to the periphery, where the light quiets and the air tells the truth. She leaned her shoulder against his. He hooked a finger through the torque ring and let it spin like a planet he hadn't expected to carry. "We didn't plan this. We planned the only part that mattered," she replied. "What we do when something breaks in the middle of our joy." He kissed her brief, certain, the way you touch a tool you trust before you pick it up again. The Viraxian hummed above them, proud and embarrassed. In the gorge, the lantern loop winked itself to sleep. The city, fed and unafraid, remembered how to be a home. Morning smelled like hot metal and cardamom. The palace was already awake, but the noise had changed timbre. Even the staff who measured dignity by polished stone found themselves humming under their breath as they laid out brooms and breakfast. Darren woke to the untrustworthy alarm of Spanner, insisting it had perfected a new coffee technique. He drank the results and declared them survivable. Saranath, amused, sipped once and said, with the courtesy of queens, "It has personality." They didn't move into the royal apartments, Dracorath offered, and Saranath, radiant with yesterday, practical, as always, asked for something else. "Give us a workshop with a door that sticks," she said. "Let the palace keep its carpets." An hour later, they were standing in a slate brick bay near the shipyards, with a window that kept pretending to be a wall, a pair of hooks still carrying the ghost weight of retired armor, and a kettle that whistled at the wrong pitch. Darren set his tool rolls on the bench, as if setting down a history. Saranath opened the shutters and let the wind argue with the room until it learned the new house rules. People came, the way water finds a slope, not for favors yet, but because certain rooms declare themselves open and mean it. A miner with a cracked pressure gauge set it on the counter and asked if he could watch the fix. A teacher brought a ragged bag of chalk and asked if the keepers could spare an afternoon at the school to explain why pumps purr. Vorax arrived with a sack of bolts that were all the wrong thread and confessed to buying them out of habit. Saranath sent him back with a list, and the kind of smile a general can follow without losing rank. They wrote a charter on the wall in chalk so no one would pretend it had been carved by the gods. A 5-line pledge for the keepers of flow. We listen first. We choose repair before pride. We share load. We chalk. We share load. We fail safely. We make more chairs. Dracorath came by, read it without moving his lips, and added 1 line with his own hand. We feed the floor first. Then he hung his torque ring on a hook by the door and left it there, as if to say emperors are most useful when they hold the door open. Work called beyond celebration. The hearth's diagnostics asked for calibration under midday strain. The canyon lifts needed new shoes. Someone had to train the first class of apprentices who would one day laugh at how crude their founder's tools had been. Saranath took the morning with the apprentices, teaching balance with a spar across 2 sawhorses and demonstrating with delighted ruthlessness how a body can feel load long before the meter blinks. Darren, knee-deep in the hearth's logic tree, found the line that insisted on hoarding backup charge and shortened its leash by 2%, grinning like a man who has found a missing screw under the mat. Between tasks, They met Dracorath in a small office that had taken up residence at the edge of the shipyard. It was the kind of room where policies are born too large. Today, it felt the word surprised him, domestic. The Emperor slid 2 pieces of metal across the desk. Keys. Old-fashioned in a culture that had forgotten how satisfying a lock can sound. "One for the workshop," he said. "One for the door behind my dais. I expect you to use both when you think I am wrong." "That's an invitation to chaos," Darren said. "That's an invitation to governance," Dracorath replied. "If we are going to live in a city that breathes without being told, I will need people who will tell me when I have forgotten how." Seranath leaned across and kissed her father's brow, the way warriors bless one another when they have remembered that tenderness is also a weapon. "We are not here to overthrow you," she said. "We are here to add chairs." By afternoon, the workshop was a choreography. The keepers held their first public lesson with more questions than answers, and exactly the right number of mistakes. Children learned to coil cables into figure-8s, while Spanner unfurled from a shelf with great seriousness and awarded lopsided stickers that said, "Coaxed, not forced." An old woman from the river district brought a pot of stew that smelled like every good decision you make after a bad week, and refused to leave until 3 different people had eaten seconds. Not everyone arrived generous. A delegation from the old houses came with smiles sharpened on yesterday's embarrassment. They couched their grievance in polite phrases: safeguards, boundaries, the optics of a human's hands on imperial engines. Seranath let them speak until their words circled back on themselves. Then, she took them to the hearth. She set their palms on the housing and asked them to listen. Not as nobles, but as neighbors. "Does this sound like a threat?" she asked. "Or like supper?" They were not converted by poetry. They were converted by warmth, blooming up their arms in a steady pulse, and by a little boy who ran past with a cup of water and announced, unconcerned, "Don't worry, it's kinder now." Some of the delegation softened. One did not. He asked, with weaponized courtesy, what would happen if the Terran left, if this experiment unraveled back into hierarchy and spectacle? Darren didn't answer. He waved a girl in a keeper mantle, forward a first-year apprentice with hair tied back in defiance of combustion. "Tell him," he said. She did. Calm. Specific. With a finger on the schematic and a smudge of solder on her cheek. The noble blinked, unmoored by the realization that power was being explained to him by someone who didn't need his permission to be excellent. He left without his argument, and with a sheet of notes he would read in secret tonight. As sunset loaded the city with the right kind of tired, Seranath and Darren walked the ramparts out of habit. The way people return to a room after everyone has gone to see what their voices did to it. The lattice sang in tune. The lantern loop slept. The crown array kept tempo, like a choir that had learned restraint. Below, the lower terraces glittered not expensively, truthfully, and the canyon lifts purred like animals who had been taught they were safe. "Do you think it will last?" he asked, not because he doubted, but because speaking of fear robs it of its appetite. "No," she said. "We will break it 100 times by accident. We will fix it 101. And us," he said. A smaller question carried with it. "We will break, too," she answered, sharp and smiling. "We will practice repair." He laughed then, the short, helpless laugh of someone who has been found. Spanner, who had been pretending to admire architecture, rotated a fraction and declared, "Statistically, this marriage has a 92% chance of increased maintenance efficiency across all municipal systems." Seranath stroked its casing. Darren flicked the drone's antenna into a gentle spiral. The drone pretended to be offended and recorded the sunset twice. A runner from the star yards found them with a message stamped in grease and conviction. Hearthlight, the seed ship whose belly had tasted a dead moon and taught it weather was fit for another run. The chart pinned to the note named 3 small worlds, whose skies kept their breath unevenly. A fourth had no sky at all, only caves that smelled of salt and old dreams. Tomorrow, Saranath said, reading the names aloud like a recipe. Tonight, we sand the bench, Darren replied. They returned to the workshop, where the crowd had thinned to the stubborn and the hungry. They sanded the bench. They oiled the hinge. They hung a bell by the door not for ceremony, for the pleasure of a sound that admits arrivals, and laughed every time Spanner rang it 3 times too often. The kettle, at last, whistled in tune. When the night was old and the city had settled to a murmur, a knock came that sounded familiar without having ever happened before. Drakarath filled the doorway, large as a storeroom, carrying under one arm a folded banner, gone gently out of date. "I thought you might need this," he said. He shook it open. Not a crest. Not a dragon. A simple field with a line etched across it, copper on black, like a river deciding how to cross a desert. For the wall. He added, "If walls are still allowed." "They are," Saranath said. "Provided they come with doors." They hung it. It sat there unproud and perfect. The Emperor turned to go and paused. "You leave at dawn," he said. "If you see a sky that refuses to breathe, argue with it until it does." "We will," Darren replied. "And if you meet a world that says it has no use for chairs," Drakarath continued, eyes warm and tired, "build one anyway." After he had gone, they stood together with the door open to the cool, listening to the city remember itself. No speeches, no epilogue, just a workshop full of tools, a charter in chalk, 2 rings thin as discipline, and a map with 4 stubborn little circles penciled in the margins. "Tomorrow," Saranath said again. "Tomorrow," Darren echoed, and reached for the light.